I'm Julie, a 38-year-old instructional designer who spent years building logical paths for others while ignoring the chaos in my own home. For a year, I played the part of the submissive wife to Daniel, a man who curated my life like a gallery of control. But that afternoon, with one steady click at my office desk, I changed every bank password he'd used to bleed me dry. When I walked into our living room, the air was ice. Daniel sat in the shadows, his face pale with a rage so visceral it made the floorboards tremble. He slammed his phone down, his voice a jagged blade. "What do you think you're doing?" He thought I was a puppet. He had no idea I'd been documenting his every crime for 6 months. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a divorce. It's a masterclass in total calculated destruction. Being an instructional designer means I'm paid to see the flaws in a system before they cause a collapse. But in my marriage to Daniel, I chose to ignore the red flags for an entire year. At 38, I wanted to believe in the version of him he sold me, the successful, steady man who just wanted to handle the boring stuff so I could focus on my career at the university. He'd take my paycheck, move it into our Wealth Builder account, and give me a kiss on the cheek. It felt like partnership. I didn't realize it was a professional heist executed by the person who shared my bed. The silence in our house after I changed those passwords wasn't peaceful, it was deafening. When I walked in that evening, Daniel didn't even have the TV on. He was just sitting there in the dark, his jaw tight, staring at a banking app that wouldn't let him in. He didn't ask how my day was. He didn't offer to start dinner. He just looked at me like I was an intruder in my own home. "The card was declined at the hardware store, Julie," he said, his voice flat but dangerous. "And now I can't get into the savings portal. Care to explain why you're locking me out of our life?" He looked pale, but not from illness. It was the pallor of a man whose bluff had finally been called. I realized then that every protective thing he'd ever done was just a way to keep me from looking at the ledge we were standing on. But the locked account wasn't the only thing I was hiding. I was already looking into the signature that didn't belong to me. I've always had a nose for inconsistencies. It's what makes me good at my job. Last month, a small, unassuming piece of mail arrived, a late notice for a high-interest bridge loan. I didn't recognize the lender. When I called them thinking it was a mistake, they sent over the digital application. My blood ran cold. The loan had been taken out 2 weeks before our wedding for $45,000. It used my social security number and my maiden name, but the signature was a clumsy imitation. Daniel hadn't just used me for a fresh start. He'd stolen my identity to bankroll the very life he was pretending to provide for me. He'd saddled me with a massive debt before we'd even cut the cake, ensuring that if I ever tried to leave, my credit would be too ruined to survive on my own. I remember when I first brought up that mystery loan over dinner. Daniel didn't flinch. He just smiled, that calm, practiced smile, and told me it was likely identity ghosting from an old data breach. He even offered to call the credit bureau for me. He was so helpful, so patronizingly sweet, that I almost apologized for ruining the mood. That was his superpower, making me feel like my intuition was just stress. But that night, I stopped listening to his words and started watching his paper trail. I realized that every time he called me honey while handing me a glass of wine, he was just making sure I stayed quiet for one more day. As I dug deeper into our shared history, I realized the man I slept next to was a ghost with a paper trail of ruined lives. The real breakdown happened when I used my university access to search legal databases. I found a civil suit from 3 years ago. A woman in another state had sued Daniel for misappropriation of funds. He wasn't a retired entrepreneur. He was a disgraced advisor who had moved here to find a new mark. Me, and the joint savings account. When I finally forced my way into the sub-menus he'd hidden from my view, I saw the truth. My salary, the $6,000 I'd been contributing every month for a year, was being drained in $1,500 chunks to pay off an out-of-court settlement for that old fraud case. I wasn't saving for retirement. I was paying for his crimes. I sat in my car in the driveway, staring at the empty balance on my screen, and the last shred of my marriage evaporated. I wasn't just a wife to him, I was a line of credit. I thought I was the only one until I found a name in those old court files, a woman who had been through this exact hell 10 years ago. Finding Sarah's name in a tiny footnote of a 10-year-old lawsuit was the only spark I needed. Finding her wasn't as hard as I'd imagined. Women ruined by men like Daniel usually leave behind a trail of either absolute silence or unshakable resilience. Sarah was the latter. When I called her, I expected a conversation filled with tears, but the voice on the other end was strangely sharp and composed. "I've been waiting for this call for a long time," she said. We met at a small diner 2 towns over, well beyond the reach of Daniel's controlling gaze. Instead of a broken woman, I found a successful real estate attorney who had spent the last decade quietly tracking Daniel's every move as a painful sort of personal hobby. Sarah explained that Daniel had a fixed script. He targeted professional women with perfect credit, used his charm to bleed them dry, and then vanished to another state. But this time he'd met his match. Sarah provided the final piece of the puzzle, a hidden account Daniel still used to funnel assets, something she'd watched for years but lacked the current evidence to expose. Together we realized that combining my proof of identity theft with her historical records would create a criminal case that Daniel couldn't simply buy his way out of. We spent the next few days in a secret war room with my lawyer preparing a flawless legal trap while I continued to play the naive wife at home. I smiled at him across the dinner table, pretending to listen to his lies about investing for our future, while in my heart I was counting down the hours until his mask would fall. He even had the audacity to hand me a power of attorney document claiming I should sign it so he could easily manage my retirement fund. He handed me the pen with a triumphant smile, thinking he had won, but he had no idea I had already signed the death warrant for his freedom long ago. On the night of our final dinner, I prepared roasted lamb, his favorite, to create an almost suffocating atmosphere of fake warmth. I set out the best china, the kind we only used for special occasions. Daniel was in high spirits, convinced that after tonight he would have total control over what remained of my money. He poured the wine, pushed the power of attorney papers toward me, and spoke honeyed words about a peaceful retirement. Instead of picking up the pen, I slowly pulled a thick manila folder from my bag and slid it toward him. I watched his face turn from flushed to a sickly gray as he flipped through the pages, photos of forged loan contracts, Sarah's affidavit, and a forensic audit showing every cent of my salary he'd drained to pay for his old sins. His mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. Daniel transformed from a polished gentleman into a cornered animal in mere seconds. He began to gasp, trying his old trick of shouting and telling me I was going crazy or misinterpreting the numbers. But I just sat there, coldly sipping my wine, watching him collapse under the weight of his own deceit. I informed him that the investors he was expecting were actually fraud investigators from the prosecutor's office, and they were already on their way. I made it clear that every act of identity theft had been reported, and his access to my life was officially over. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of his hands hitting the table in desperation, the sound of a man who had lost everything. He looked at me and realized for the first time that the woman sitting across from him wasn't his victim, but the person who would put him in prison. He thought he had married a submissive woman, but he had actually invited a prosecutor into his own home. The months that followed were a blur of justice being served. Daniel was stripped of everything: the car, the status, and the freedom he had stolen from others. He stood in that courtroom not as a powerful man, but as a pathetic fraudster facing prison time and total bankruptcy. The polished veneer was gone, replaced by a public criminal record he could never erase. I didn't stay to hear the final sentencing. I was already busy starting a new life in a sun-drenched apartment where no dirty secrets could hide. My credit was restored, my reputation was clean, and I held my head higher than ever at my university office. I knew I hadn't just saved myself. I had brought justice for Sarah and the other women he had destroyed. This morning, I looked at my new bank statement while sitting with a cup of coffee on my balcony. That balance belongs entirely to me. Every penny is transparent, and the only person with the password is me. I'm not just a survivor. I'm a victor in a war I chose to win through composure and intellect. I've learned that age doesn't make a woman weaker, it makes her dangerous to those who underestimate her. Daniel spent years rehearsing for this marriage, but he forgot one thing: I'm an expert at spotting a fake, and he was the biggest fraud of them all. If this story of reclaiming power and exposing a fraudster resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of justice and empowerment. We believe that sharing these journeys helps us all stay vigilant and strong. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think Julie's method of confrontation was the right move? Or would you have handled a person like Daniel differently? Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be true? Your insights and experiences add so much depth to our community and help other women realize they aren't alone in their struggles. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us continue to bring these powerful stories to life. Thank you for being part of our journey and for standing with Julie as she finally took back the keys to her own life.